Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the three-volume historical series by author Shelby Foote, The Civil War: A Narrative. The Civil War: A Narrative consists of three parts: 1958's Fort Sumter to Perryville, 1963's Fredericksburg to Meridian, and 1974's Red River to Appomattox. Shelby Foote. All right. I discussed Shelby Foote a little bit in my review of Ken Burns' Civil War documentary because Shelby Foote plays a major role in that documentary. Foote's background: Mississippi-born author whose bread and butter was actually novels. He was a novelist who wrote several works of historical fiction, historical novels, utilizing his own interest in history, and more specifically military history, to create narratives that, at least from what I understand, are compelling and generally intriguing. I've not read any of them, so I can't comment. But the most relevant novel to our story is 1952's Shiloh, which is a historical retelling of the Battle of Shiloh from the Civil War. According to at least folks at the time, people praised it for its historical accuracy and how compelling of a narrative it drove and drew up. So Random House Publishers was who ended up reaching out to Foote, asking if he wanted to write a one-volume history of the Civil War. That one-volume history of the Civil War, which was drafted up for its centennial anniversary, that was kind of the event they had in mind, ended up becoming this three-volume history, this massive three-volume history that took about 20 years or so to complete. And this three-volume history has become a major kind of touch point, a major sort of landmark in the discussion of Civil War history. It was widely acclaimed when it came out by the general public. It turned Foote himself into one of the country's leading Civil War experts. Even though he himself was not a trained historian necessarily, he did do a lot of research for these books, and so as a result became a very public-facing figure who had a lot of expertise on this subject, which then translates into his appearance in Ken Burns' documentary. He ends up becoming maybe the dominant voice in that documentary and helps control kind of a big part of that narrative. Now, Shelby Foote is a very complicated man. And the complications with Shelby Foote are so directly tied into this three-volume trilogy that there's no sense in trying to separate one discussion point from the other, so they're going to be kind of intertwined. Shelby Foote was deeply, deeply a Southern man. He was born in Mississippi, lived in the South pretty much his whole life, and that's fine. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. He was also someone who was very proud of his cultural heritage. Okay, that's fine. But what we run into, and what we run into is kind of a major issue when we talk about Shelby Foote as a figure, and when we talk about this trilogy of Civil War books as, works of history or what have you. The issue we run into is Foote's perspective and how it has aged in the popular consciousness. Foote was someone who felt a very deep passion towards the South, towards his Southern comrades, his ancestors, if you will, and makes that very apparent in his written works and his interviews and all sorts of things. And so that's a whole kind of rabbit hole that we're going to have to go down. And it's a rabbit hole that has, in part, made this three-volume series, which I read every single page of, it has made this extremely difficult to get through. I don't like to talk about anything that I'm reading for this channel or otherwise as a slog. I try not to unless the books are objectively bad, and I'm just going to say I don't think these books are objectively bad by any means. But this was a slog. All three of these books together sum up to about, it was close to 3,000 pages in the editions that I was reading. And there's, I mean, it's close to 3,000 pages worth of military history and just general kind of, rapturing and rhapsodizing about the state of America at that period of time, specifically on the battlefield and connected to the war. And that is probably something that quite a few people are super invested in, super interested in. I'm going to be very honest. I think after reading this, I become very aware that military history is not my personal forte. So I want you to take that and have that understanding before we continue, because these books are not built for me just kind of on a fundamental level, and they're not necessarily built for what I want to get out of something that I'm reading in any sort of a casual way. But let's talk about the positives of this three-part narrative. The biggest positive to me is Foote's prose. I think Foote, maybe you could argue, is a bit archaic of a writer. I know some people say that his prose is a little bit kind of 19th century, early 20th century coded, with the, like, how much he kind of pontificates, just kind of uses these like extraneous words and things like that. And I understand that to an extent, but I will say Foote, his novelist background, one, prepares him for writing these sorts of long form stories, but two, I think allows him to keep them engaging. This is far from the driest military history that you will ever read. I actually think that in terms of keeping the reader engaged, keeping the stakes apparent, and making sure you're aware of what is going on, this book succeeds in spades. All three volumes do. And that's something I think to be lauded, is that Foote is hyper aware of narrative, is aware of pacing and how to balance that pacing with the scope that he wants and knows the story needs. And I think that is, like I said, that's impressive. And that helped me from burning out on the books sooner. And there were certainly moments, I think, where his storytelling was really apparent and really, really kind of came through. So that's something. I think it's also very obvious that Foote knows a lot as far as kind of what he's talking about. His research is very evident throughout, and he has very detailed kind of outlines of where certain battles took place, where these armies were stationed, describing kind of the terrain of the land and that sort of thing. He's clearly a very knowledgeable guy. And so when I talk about the critiques, I want to make it clear that it's not his knowledge necessarily that I am detracting from. So the flip side is, as I mentioned, Shelby Foote is not a trained historian. And one of the pieces that a lot of historians especially have struggled with the Civil War narrative, and have really struggled with since the start, it's been a critique for ages, is Foote does not cite sources at all. At the back of his books, he will outline the major sources that he uses to construct the narrative in a very general way, but he never once utilizes a footnote. He never uses an endnote. There is no true bibliography to speak of. And Foote's justification for that has always been, at the time, was that he felt using references and in-text citations and that sort of thing would take the reader out of the narrative, and that he wasn't concerned with facts, he was concerned with the truth. And that is, it's a perspective that I can understand a novelist having. Someone who is concerned with the flow of the story and not wanting that to be interrupted. I can understand that. If I put myself in his shoes, I get it. But I'm not entirely sure how a work like this that just kind of rejects the fundamental concept of like historical writing. I'm not really sure how this was ever really taken seriously as a historical piece. And I think if you had adapted this, and tried to advertise this as a work of semi-historical fiction or something like that, that would be fine, because Lord knows Shelby Foote loves his anecdotes. He loves utilizing these yarns and these stories that he read in other books and things like that, and attributing exact quotes to specific people. And they're usually very dramatic and very theatrical and Hollywood-like. He loves using those, and that's fine. But again, without the citations backing them up, a lot of these stories are fully apocryphal, fully anecdotal, and don't necessarily hold up to historical rigor whatsoever if you look into it. So that's a huge weakness in the book, for the book in general. And again, if you were treating this more as a work of entertainment rather than a piece of objectively informative historical writing, maybe you could look through that. Maybe you could look past that. People have compared the Civil War narrative. They've called it like the American Iliad, or someone has referred to it as such. And, the Iliad, for those who haven't read it, is this very like sweeping work about, historical battles, right? And the whole book is concerned with warfare. It's concerned with the nitty gritty of warfare, but it's also very like, I don't even know what the word is, but it's fantastical. It's very like, it's not necessarily meant to be taken literally from a historical standpoint, because there's also a bunch of segues, a bunch of anecdotes about the Grecian gods and things like that. And for as much as Homer or whoever actually wrote the Iliad may have believed in that sort of thing, again, obviously that doesn't stand up to historical rigor, but we treat it as this work of epic fiction that also has roots in some vaguely historical events. And maybe if you could look at Foote's work through that lens, you might find some appreciation of it. That's fine. But then we get to the actual framing of the story. And this ties back into Shelby Foote's own perspective and his heritage. This is meant to be a very balanced look at the Civil War. And I'll put balanced in quotation marks, because Foote wants to lend equal weight to the stories, the tragedy, and the humanity of both the Union and the Confederacy. So you get pretty much equal playing time given to both U.S. President Abraham Lincoln and Confederate President Jefferson Davis. It's actually Davis's story who begins the three-part narrative, and it's Davis's story that ends the three-part narrative. And in between all that, of course, you have portrayals of all the different kind of figures and generals and war heroes on both sides. You have your Ulysses S. Grants, your William Tecumseh Shermans, your George McClellans on the Union side. You have your Robert E. Lees, your Stonewall Jacksons, and your Nathan Bedford Forrests on the Confederate side. And Foote's perspective is that this whole big thing was a tragedy, and that there are heroes on both sides fighting for causes that they believed were just. And his job, as he sees it, is to take those stories and paint them in a very romantic light. This is very much a story of great men, in all caps. This is a story filled with romanticizing and revering these great men, painting this era of American history through rose-colored glasses. And, just to speak bluntly, right, that is not a perspective on the Civil War that has aged well whatsoever. That is a perspective on historical events that, for one thing, entirely erases a huge part of the conversation, which is, of course, the role of African Americans and racism in the whole piece. Now, Shelby Foote, this is where we get into lost cause ideology and stuff. From everything that I've read, after reading these books, after reading other pieces, I do not believe that Shelby Foote was a lost causer by definition. What I think Shelby Foote did and is guilty of is utilizing the work of historians who were sympathizers to the lost cause mythology as a foundational point of his works, and sympathizing with those historians in general. I want to make that clear. Foote acknowledges and acknowledges in these books as well that slavery was a major cause of the Civil War. I think the problem is Foote is not especially interested in slavery. He's not interested in exploring the consequences of slavery. He's not interested really in exploring the lead up to the war, hardly at all. He's not interested in exploring the stories of those formerly enslaved people, and how they, many of them ended up volunteering or being conscripted into the war themselves, and how they played into that. Foote really doesn't really seem to give a shit about that type of thing because it doesn't fit into this grander narrative. He has these major figures that he wants to tell the stories of, who all happen to be white men, and he's going to tell those stories come hell or high water. And if, the people of color, the African Americans who were involved in that story don't really get much time in these pages, then so be it. Sucks. And that attitude is clearly something that I think most Civil War historians have left behind at this point in our history, some 50 years removed from the last volume of this history being published. And yeah, it means that this book occasionally can be kind of conducive to groans and things like that, with these reverential portraits of these Confederate soldiers, in particular Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you're not aware of Nathan Bedford Forrest, Confederate general who Shelby Foote held up as one of the two great geniuses of the American Civil War, the other one being Abraham Lincoln. Foote had a portrait of Forrest on his on the wall of his house somewhere. And, Forrest, if you look into his story, was, I'm sure, a great general. Also a raging racist, who, among other things, helped form the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. And, that is where you get into kind of these late stage interviews with Shelby Foote, which you can read about on his Wikipedia has examples of it, for God's sake, but these interviews of Foote where he's kind of doing circles around himself, trying to justify Nathan Bedford Forrest as a human, saying that the initial Ku Klux Klan they weren't too bad because they weren't lynching people or whatever, which is not true from what I understand. And then you get into this whole, you get into the weeds of his other quotes about how black people are ungrateful because they reacted to the Rodney King riots or something like that. I don't think it was specifically that, but there's some quote where he talks about how they were acting like animals and they're proving the Confederates right or something like that. This is a guy who, while not a lost causer, clearly had perspectives on African Americans that were built around racism. Probably the type of racism that was rampant in Mississippi around that time. So he's a product of his environment, whatever. But the overall point is all this stuff kind of hangs over this 3-part trilogy, you know, like a weighted blanket or something, but like the worst kind of weighted blanket. And you have to parse through all of that bullshit and all of this incredible attention to detail that is not cited whatsoever. And you're constantly left wondering with every anecdote that he says, well, did that really happen? When he says anything about a Confederate whoever, you are left wondering the question, how much of what color rose-tinted glasses is Foote wearing for this particular portrayal, right? Like, is he really selling his subject, really hyping his subject up, or is that a more or less honest portrayal? I mean, you can't trust him. You can't trust his portrayal of these people. At least not if you're looking for historical accuracy. If you are looking for a perspective that is truly even-keeled and is not attempting to portray the aggressors, the enemies, the, dare I say it, clear evil of this war, that is not trying to portray them as equal in a way to the good guys. Once again, he might not be a lost causer, and he talks about how, the Confederates were doomed and it was their own fault, and slavery is evil and it's never going to last. And that doesn't mean that he doesn't treat his subjects with the grace and respect that history, I think, has proven that they don't really deserve. And so that's where we kind of end. That's where we kind of leave off. It's about almost 3,000 pages of this constant battle, this constant back and forth, literally from the first page to the last. This attempt at equalizing the Union and the Confederacy alike. And, it's tough. It's tough to get through. And it's a shame because there are some amazingly, excellent bits of writing. I think if Foote had tried to, emphasize had not advertised this as a work of pure nonfiction, and had maybe tried to emphasize the more fantastical elements of it, if this had been a work of historical fiction, I think its sins would be more forgivable. Because it wouldn't be held to the same standards. But this is what we have. And, I don't necessarily regret reading it because this is a huge piece of Civil War historical discourse. It's still in print to this day. You see it at pretty much every bookstore that you walk into, more or less. But man alive, I am looking forward to reading James McPherson's History of the Civil War next, which was written, I think, in part to kind of set the record straight about some of the things that Foote's history had kind of burned into the popular consciousness. So that will be interesting. I look forward to reading that and to eventually reviewing that. But for now, woof. This is a lot. And I cannot say in good consciousness that I recommend reading this 3-part narrative. I think there's value to it. There's some things that are genuinely impressively well done. I cannot deny it. But in the year 2024, I think this is outdated, to put it kindly. And that's it. I've got nothing else to say. I want to be done with it. So, thank you so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time, right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.